It started out subtle, almost unnoticeable at first. We'd been married for years, and like any couple, we had our ups and downs. But this was different. Sandy. My wife seemed distant in a way I couldn't quite put my finger on. Conversations turned into one-sided exchanges, and her laughter, which used to fill the house, was replaced with silence. At first, I chalked it up stress. We'd had a rough patch after the fire that destroyed our old house, and moving into my grandmother's place wasn't her idea of a fresh start. But something about her demeanor made it clear this wasn't just about the fire. Little things started to add up. She'd come home late from work, blaming it on meetings that didn't seem to exist. Her phone, once casually left on the kitchen counter, became glued to her hand, the screen always tilted away from me. And then there were the nights. She'd conveniently forget to wear her wedding ring, claiming she had been in a rush or that it didn't fit quite right anymore. I tried to ignore it. I really did. I told myself that every relationship has its phases, and maybe this was just one of those moments where we needed to find our way back to each other. But it wasn't long before I realized I was the only one trying. The tipping point for me wasn't even dramatic. It was in the small, mundane moments. One evening, I asked her if she wanted to watch one of her favorite shows together, something we used to do almost religiously. She looked at me like I had asked her to solve a complex math equation. "No, I'm tired," she said. Barely glancing up from her phone later that night, I saw her laughing at something on her screen, completely engrossed. That wasn't the kind of laughter that comes from a funny meme. It was the kind that comes when you're talking to someone who makes you feel alive. By that point, I couldn't ignore the signs anymore. She was pulling away from me, and there was someone else there had to be. I tried to reason with myself, thinking maybe I was overreacting. But the reality was staring me in the face. The little provocations, the sudden change in her wardrobe, and the absolute lack of intimacy. All of it pointed to the same conclusion. She wasn't just tired of being my wife. She was either already with someone else or seriously considering it. I knew I needed to address it. But how do you start that conversation? "Hey, are you cheating on me?" It's not exactly something you casually drop during dinner. So I waited. I observed. I started noticing patterns. How she'd suddenly remember she had plans, or how her tone would shift when certain names came up in conversation. She wasn't just distant. She was gone, at least emotionally. It was like living with a stranger looking back. I think part of me had already accepted it. She had made it easier by treating me like I didn't exist. But there was still a part of me that held on to hope that maybe this was something we could fix. That maybe if I gave her enough space, she'd come back to me. It was foolish, I know. But when you build a life with someone, you don't just give up without a fight. At least, that's what I thought at the time. The hardest part wasn't the suspicion itself. It was the waiting. Waiting to catch her in a lie. Waiting for her to admit what I already knew. Waiting for her to care enough to even bother hiding it. I felt like I was living on borrowed time. Like every interaction we had was just one step closer to the inevitable, and deep down, I think she knew that too. The night it all came crashing down wasn't anything out of the ordinary, at least not at first. I came home from work, same as usual, and the house was quiet. It was winter, so it got dark early, and when I pulled into the driveway, I noticed something off immediately. Her car wasn't in the garage, and the porch light wasn't on. Normally, that wouldn't bother me, but given the way things had been late, it made my stomach twist. I walked in and called out for her, but there was no response. At first, I thought she might have stepped out to run an errand or visit a friend. But as I made my way through the house, I saw her bedroom light was on. I headed upstairs, and that's when I saw her. She was standing at the dresser putting on makeup. She wasn't wearing the usual jeans and the sweater she threw on for casual errands. No, she was wearing a black dress, a new one I'd never seen before. It had a higher hemline and a neckline that left little to the imagination. The heels next to her were the tallest I'd ever seen her wear. I stood in the doorway for a few moments, just watching. She didn't even notice me at first. She was too focused on her lipstick, a bold red that made her look completely different. It hit me then. This wasn't just any night out. This was deliberate. She was dressing up for someone. My chest felt tight, but I stayed calm. I didn't yell. I didn't demand answers. Instead, I asked, "Are we going somewhere?" Her hand paused mid-application, and she glanced at me through the mirror. There wasn't even a flicker of guilt in her expression. Just irritation. "No," she said flatly. "I'm going out. I have a date." I didn't react immediately. I think she was expecting an explosion, a shouting match, maybe even some begging. But I just stood there staring at her. "Did you hear me?" She said, her voice sharp. I said, "I have a date. I'm going out with another man." My heart was pounding, but I refused to give her the satisfaction of a scene. "No," I said, keeping my tone. Even she turned to face me, clearly annoyed. No, what? You're not going out on a date." I said, "at least not while we live under the same roof. If you want to see someone else, fine. But pack your things and find somewhere else to stay. Once you're out, I'll file the divorce papers and you can do whatever you want." Her laugh was sharp and bitter. "I'm not leaving. She said I like this house, and when it's mine, I'll do whatever I want with it. If you keep acting like an idiot, I'll make sure I get most of the money when we sell it." I took a deep breath, holding on to what little patience I had left. "Do us both a favor," I said, "and stay with your parents until this is over. You're the one who wants out, not me." She CCR her arms, a smug look on her face. "Oh, I'll be back in 30 minutes. She said you'd better not be here. When I get back, or I'll call the police. I'll tell them you threatened me, maybe even hit me. You know how it works. They'll hold you for 48 hours, and by then, I'll have changed the locks." I felt a cold anger settle in. She really thought she could manipulate me like that. "You're making a mistake," I said, my voice calm but firm. "You think you can scare me, but I'm not going anywhere." She rolled her eyes and went back to the mirror, muttering something about needing to fix her lipstick. I left the room, my mind racing. If she thought she could walk all over me, she had another thing coming. When I left that room, my mind was racing, but not with panic. I knew her game, and if she wanted to play dirty, I could adapt. She thought she had all the leverage, her threats, her confidence. The way she spoke, like she already owned the house in my life. It lit a fire in me. But instead of losing my temper, I focused on what I could control. I wasn't about to let her walk all over me without a fight. I walked into the garage and saw the aluminum baseball bat leaning against the wall. It was the same bat I used during summer games with friends. I picked it up, testing its weight in my hand. Her car was parked outside, and I could almost see her smug face as she imagined driving off to meet her lover, leaving me. Behind a stew. Well, not tonight. I walked over to her car and swung the bat hard. 4 good hits shattered the headlights and tail lights, leaving the car useless for a night drive. I wasn't done. I knew her routine. Her purse was always on the kitchen counter. When I went back inside there, it was right where I expected. I opened it, careful not to make a mess, and found her phone. A part of me almost laughed at how predictable she was. I took it back to the garage and removed the battery, setting it on my workbench. With one solid hit of the hammer, the phone snapped into 3 pieces. Satisfied, I put the broken pieces back into her purse, minus the battery. She wasn't calling anyone tonight. Next, I noticed a small packet of condoms in her bag. For a split second, I considered piercing them with a pin just to mess with her. But then I thought better of it. She'd probably just accuse me of trying to frame her, and that wasn't a headache I needed. By the time she came into the kitchen, she was fully dressed. Black dress heels and that ridiculous red lipstick. She looked at me with a mix of irritation and smugness, as if she'd already won whatever twisted game she was playing out. She said, pointing to the door like I was some kind of intruder. I didn't move. Instead, I poured myself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, taking a slow sip. "Good luck with your night," I said casually. Her eyes narrowed. "What did you do?" she asked, her voice sharper. Now I smiled and took another sip. "Why don't you go check your car?" I suggested. Her heels clicked loudly as she stomped out the front door. Moments later, I heard her shouting. Angry, frustrated, furious. She stormed back into the house, her face awry with rage. "What the hell did you do to my car?" she yelled. I shrugged, keeping my tone light. "It's parked on the street. Anything could have happened, you bastard," she hissed. "I'll just call him to pick me up." "Go ahead," I said, gesturing to her bag. "You'll need your phone for that." Her face froze for a second, and then she yanked the phone out of her purse. When she realized it wouldn't turn on her, fury reached a whole new level. "You broke my phone." I leaned back and crossed my arms. "Maybe you should have kept a better eye on it." At that point, she was practically vibrating with anger. She swapped her heels for sneakers and stormed out, probably thinking she could knock on a neighbor's door and borrow their phone. I watched from the window as she went from house to house, growing more and more frustrated when nobody answered. She was shouting. By the time she reached the end of the block, I leaned against the counter, sipping my coffee, and waited. I knew it was only a matter of time before she found someone willing to help or got desperate enough to call the cops. Either way, I was ready. She thought she was in control, but by the time this night was over, she'd realized just how wrong she was. I didn't have to wait long before things took a turn, though not the one I'd expected. As I sipped my coffee, I could hear her heels pounding against the floor above me. Then silence. That was my cue to check what she was up to. I glanced out the window just in time to see her walking toward the garage. She wasn't going to give up on her plans that easily. The thing is, I knew Sandy. She was impulsive, sure, but predictable in her desperation. She'd already figured out that her car was out of commission, and she must have assumed I'd left my Suburban, the Beast, as she used to call it, sitting in the garage just waiting to save her night. What she didn't know was that I had disconnected the garage door opener earlier. In case she tried something exactly like this, I followed quietly and peed them through the side door. As she climbed into the driver's seat of the Beast, the engine roared to life with a deep, guttural sound that echoed through the garage. For a second, I thought about stopping her, but I decided to let her make her own mess. She pressed the garage door button, and when nothing happened, she tried again. Frustration flashed across her face, but instead of stopping to think she did the most Sandy thing imaginable, she hit the gas. The Beast roared forward, slamming into the garage door with a metallic screech that sent chills down my spine. The power of the 454 horsepower engine was too much for the old door. The sound of tearing metal and cracking wood filled the air as the beast burst out of the garage, dragging what was left of the door along with it. But that wasn't the worst part. Parked directly behind the garage, in what was probably the worst possible spot, was a police cruiser. 2 officers had just arrived after Sai's earlier threats to call the cops. The beast smashed into the front of the cruiser with such force that it pushed the car back a few feet, leaving the front end crumpled like an accordion. One of the officers had just opened the driver's side door. When the crash happened, the door swung back violently, knocking him off balance and throwing him to the ground. His partner, a redhead I remembered from high. School was already on the move, yanking Sandy out of the beast by her hair before she could even process what had just happened. "Get on the ground." The red-headed officer shouted her voice, echoing across the neighborhood. Sandy screamed something incoherent, flailing as she was dragged to the pavement. She didn't even fight back properly, just sobbed and cursed as the officer cuffed her. Meanwhile, I rushed over to check on the officer who had been hit. His nose was clearly broken and blood streamed down his face, but he was conscious. "Hold still," I told him, cradling his head to keep his neck stable. "Help is on the way." The next 20 minutes were a blur of chaos. Neighbors peeked out from behind curtains, some bold enough to step outside and gawk. Ambulances arrived, lights flashing, and more police cars filled the street. I answered questions while keeping one eye on Sandy, who sat in the back of another cruiser, handcuffed and wailing like a child who'd been caught stealing by the time the dust settled. Sandy was on her way to the hospital with a bruised ego, a stiff neck from the airbag, and a growing list of charges: reckless endangerment, property damage, and assaulting a police officer with a vehicle, to name a few of them. As for me, I stood in the driveway watching the wreckage of the beast being hauled away. I should have been furious, but honestly, I just felt relieved. This wasn't just about the car or the mess she'd made of the garage. It was about finally having proof, undeniable evidence, that Sandy was her own worst enemy. For all her threats, her manipulation, and her arrogance, she had finally hit a wall, literally and figuratively, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. The days following the chaos were a mix of police interviews, lawyer consultations, and awkward phone calls from mutual acquaintances who had heard about the fiasco. Sandy didn't waste any time making things worse for herself. After she was released on bail paid by her parents, of course, she withdrew almost every penny from our shared bank account, $9,000 gone in an instant, leaving me with a measly $1,000 to my name. I wasn't surprised. It was just another desperate move from someone who thought she was still in control. My lawyer and I got to work immediately. Thankfully, I had already anticipated something like this months ago before things spiraled out of control. I had transferred ownership of our house to my parents, legally. It wasn't even in my name anymore. I knew Sandy would demand half of everything, and I wasn't about to let her get it. She had no idea what she was walking into. At our first meeting, Sandy showed up with her lawyer, a sleazy guy with a bad comb-over, who clearly thought this was going to be an easy win. They didn't waste any time rattling off her demands. She wants the house, or half its value. Her lawyer began smugly sliding a stack of papers across the table. "We'll also be requesting all the new furniture, the appliances, and a portion of the insurance payout from the fire." I glanced at my lawyer, who didn't even blink. Instead, he calmly pulled out a document and handed it over. "The house isn't community property," he explained. "It belongs to my client's father. Sandy has no legal claim to it." Her face went pale for a moment, but she quickly recovered, leaning over to whisper something to her lawyer. He looked through the document, his expression tightening with every word he read. "This can't be right," he muttered. But it was. They had nothing. And as for the furniture and appliances, my lawyer continued, "We have receipts showing they were purchased with funds from my client's father's account. They aren't marital property either." S's frustration was palpable. She crossed her arms, glaring at me as if I'd personally betrayed her, which was ironic considering the circumstances. "You're leaving me with nothing," she finally snapped. "That's not entirely true," my lawyer replied smoothly. "We're willing to let you keep one of the bedroom sets, out of nostalgia." I could almost hear her teeth grinding. She stormed out of the room shortly after leaving her lawyer to negotiate the rest. In the end, she got to keep her car. A portion of the money she withdrew, and not much else. Her lawyer knew she was in a losing position and convinced her to settle before things got worse. The judge didn't hold back when finalizing the divorce. He commended me for being proactive in protecting my assets, which was his polite way of saying Sandy had been outsmarted at every turn. By the time the gavel hit, I was free, and she was left to deal with the legal mess she'd created by ramming the beast into a police cruiser. It wasn't about revenge for me. It was about self-preservation. Sandy had tried to manipulate, intimidate, and bully her way into taking everything. But she underestimated me. She thought I'd just roll over and let her win instead. I played the long game, and when it was over, I walked away with my dignity intact. After the dust settled and the ink dried on the divorce papers, I finally had a moment to breathe. It felt strange at first, almost like I was stepping into someone else's life. For years, my routine, my thoughts, even my happiness, had revolved around Sandy and our marriage, and now she was just gone. The house was quiet, but not in a lonely way, more like peaceful. I could finally focus on myself and what I wanted, instead of constantly walking on eggshells around her. I spent the first few months getting my life back on track, fixing up the house, reconnecting with old friends, and finding hobbies I'd neglected for years. It wasn't about distracting myself. It was about reclaiming who I was before everything fell apart. One of the first things I did was start going to the shooting range again. It had always been something I enjoyed. But during the last few years of my marriage, I hadn't made time for it. On one of those trips, I ran into Sergeant Swee, the same officer who had arrested Sandy during the garage incident. She was there in jeans and a casual top, completely different from the uniformed, non-nonsense persona I'd seen before. We talked for a while, and I found out she was newly single too. Her divorce had been messy, though not quite as chaotic as mine. One thing led to another, and I asked her out. To my surprise, she said, "Yes, that first date was something else." I showed up in my best suit, probably overdoing it, but she seemed to appreciate the effort. She made it clear early on that she wasn't interested in games or drama, and honestly, neither was I. 9 months later, we got married, and I can genuinely say it's been the happiest time of my life. She's not just my wife. She's my partner in every sense of the word. We've built a life together that's based on mutual respect and trust, two things that had been missing for a long time in my previous marriage. As for Sandy, I heard bits and pieces about her through mutual acquaintances. She remarried twice, and from what I gathered, her second husband seems to be keeping her in check. Good for him. I guess I don't hold any anger toward her anymore. It took me a while to get to that place, but I realized that holding on to resentment would only keep me stuck in the past. These days, my life is simple and fulfilling. My wife and I recently celebrated our 25th wedding anniversary with a river cruise in Europe. a trip she'd always dreamed of. Our kids are grown and doing well, and I couldn't be prouder of them. Just last week, we handed over my grandmother's old house to our daughter as a wedding gift. It felt right, like a full circle moment. That house had been the site of so much pain and transition. But now it's starting a new chapter for her. Every now and then, I think back to those chaotic days with Sandy. Not with regret, but with gratitude. They taught me a lot about who I am and what I'm capable of handling. Life doesn't always go the way you plan, but sometimes it's the unexpected detours that lead you to exactly where you're meant to be. And standing here now, I wouldn't change a thing.